Were the barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire peaceful and the Germanic tribes just settled on the territory of the Western Roman Empire? Or were these invasions actually quite violent? Well, friends of late Roman history, that is a question that seems to be hotly debated nowadays, so let us try to understand what really happened. What if I told you that the way in which we interpret history changes a lot depending on our current own living circumstances? History is always an interpretation of past events, and when we interpret, we invariably pour in our own biases and subjective perceptions of reality. And this is of course also true for late Roman history and the time of the Great Migrations. Nowadays, there seems to be a commonly accepted view that the barbarian invasions of Rome were actually quite peaceful, that these Germanic tribes just settled on the territory of the Western Empire without any bloodshed. But, as I hope that I will be able to show you, this view is fairly recent. In Victorian and pre-Victorian England, for example, it was a completely accepted view to see the Germanic invasions of the Roman Empire as very violent in nature. Edward Gibbon described in lively colors the destruction caused by the barbarian invasions of the Western Roman Empire, and the Victorian-era British historian Edward Freeman even defended the brutality with which the Anglo-Saxons conquered the Romano-Britons, writing that, quote, "It has turned out much better in the end that our forefathers did kill or drive out nearly all the people whom they found in the land." End quote. But also on paintings from the era, we can see how the people back then saw the Germanic invasions, such as Delacroix's painting of Attila the Hun from 1847, or the paintings by Ludovico Pogliagli depicting the sack of Rome by the Visigoths, also painted in the 19th century. Now, very interestingly, this was the mainstream view of historians even until after World War II. Only when the horrific memories of the world wars started to fade and a peaceful Europe became established, only then, quite interestingly, did the narrative about the barbarian invasions of Rome suddenly also turn quite positive. The book titled The Germanic Invasions, The Making of Europe AD 400 to 600 from 1975 suddenly painted these invasions in a much more positive light, as a necessary occurrence in order to establish modern Europe. This view was then taken to the next level in 1980 by the Canadian historian Walter Goffard. He challenged the very idea of invasions. Instead, he argued that the Germanic tribes were settled on the territories of the Roman Empire as foederati. He argued that, quote, "What we call the fall of the Western Roman Empire was an imaginative experiment that got a little out of hand," end quote. Meaning that Rome was not overrun by the Germanic tribes, but Rome had voluntarily delegated away power from the empire to the new rising Germanic kingdoms. In even more recent books, such as Kingdoms of the Empire, the integration of barbarians in late antiquity from 1997, there is absolutely no hint anymore of brutality or violence in these invasions. Instead, the narrative is that the barbarians settled into an ever-evolving Roman Empire, which then gradually morphed into the medieval times. The book Society and Culture in Late Antique Gaul by Matheson and Schanzer from 2002 was even more positive, where, according to the authors, the Germanic settlements occurred, quote, "in a natural, organic, and generally ironic manner," end quote. The authors even take issue with historians who still, quote, "demonize the barbarian settlements." We see a clear trend here. The more peaceful our own current society, and the more peaceful the upbringing of modern-day historians, the more positive is their own view of the Germanic invasions. We have to be aware that history is but an interpretation of what really happened, and is thus per definition always subject to our own biases, worldviews, hopes and wishes. Very often, a parallel is drawn between migrations in late Roman times and our own migrations of current times. Therefore, you will find wildly differing views of the Germanic migrations depending on the political views of the authors. And please like this video and subscribe so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And please consider supporting our work on Patreon or via YouTube membership, because the long-term sustainability of this channel really depends on your support. YouTube is not quite generous to such a niche topic about the late Roman Empire, and the ad revenue from the videos is low. So in order to be long-term sustainable, I unfortunately need your financial support via Patreon or YouTube membership, as embarrassed as I am to say this. And I would like to especially thank our new Sol Invictus member, Whit Lamson. Thank you so much, Whit Lamson, for supporting this channel in such a generous way. And we also have a new Kaisar member, Michael Weitzman or Michael Weitzmann. Thanks so much, Michael, for your support. Seriously, this channel would not work without our Patreons and YouTube members, and I want to thank each and everyone that is supporting this channel in any form. Gratias tibiago, amici. But now the question is, were these Germanic invasions really so peaceful? Or is this just wishful thinking by modern historians who have never experienced the brutality of wars or invasions themselves? Luckily, we have some first-hand eyewitness accounts surviving from that time. The Vita Sancti Severini, the life of Saint Severin, written by the monk Eugipius, is a first-hand account of how the Roman people of Phraetia and Noricum were evacuated in the last years of the Western Roman Empire, under constant attack by the Alemanni and Rugi. Death and killing was a constant theme, and many innocent Roman civilians were killed by the barbarians. The last remaining Romans were then evacuated under Odoacer to Italy. I talked in great detail about these events in this video here. Or we have surviving texts by Posidius, a friend of Augustinus of Hippo, who wrote about the Vandal invasions of Africa the following, quote, "Everywhere throughout the regions of Mauretania they gave vent to their rage by every kind of atrocity and cruelty, devastating everything they possibly could by pillage, murder, various tortures, fires, and other indescribable evil deeds. No sex or age was spared, not even God's priests and ministers." End quote. Victor of Vita, also a contemporary of that time, writes about the horrors of the Vandal invasions in even more graphic detail. Quote, "In their barbaric frenzy, they even snatched children from their mothers' breasts and dashed the guiltless infants to the ground. They held others by the feet upside down and cut them in two." End quote. Or in a poem from the early 5th century, Orientus of Auk described the invasions of Gaul after 407 AD. Quote, "Some lay as food for dogs, for many a burning roof both took their soul and cremated their corpse. Through villages and villas, through countryside and marketplace, through all regions, on all roads, in this place and that, there was death, misery, destruction, burning, and mourning. The whole of Gaul smoked like a funeral pyre." End quote. Even though some of these accounts might be exaggerated, they quite likely contain some truth in them. But we can verify some of these occurrences by letters from these times. In one such letter, Pope Leo I wrote to the bishops of Mauretania, quote, "Now concerning those who, having made a holy vow of virginity, have suffered the violence of barbarians, and have lost their spotless purity not in spirit but in body, we consider such moderation ought to be observed, that they should be neither degraded to the rank of widows, nor yet reckoned in the number of holy and undefiled virgins." End quote. This means that even nuns or women that had taken up vows of virginity were not spared by the Vandals. Or in another letter, Leo wrote in 458 to a bishop in Aquileia how to deal with wives who had remarried after their husbands had been carried off into slavery by the Huns, and who had managed to free themselves and return. His advice was to return to the previous state of marital status without punishing anyone, because of the extraordinary circumstances. These letters, and there are many more of that kind, show that the barbarian invasions must certainly have been brutal, and that the graphic accounts, which I read before, must have certainly contained some truth. The sacks of Rome from 410, 455 and 472 are other good examples in which countless people had died and Germanic invaders had looted the city with impunity and often before besieged the city multiple times, causing great famines and spread of disease that would kill thousands. But even some centuries earlier, during the crisis of the 3rd century, the same Germanic tribes which would later successfully invade the Roman Empire were already present, looting, sacking and destroying everything in their path. The Balkans were ravaged in the mid-200s by the Goths and the Heruli. Athens was sacked and badly damaged. The city would never completely recover from the sack of the Heruli in 267 AD. The Agri Decumates were lost and overrun by the Alemanni. Dacia was evacuated by Aurelian. The Vandals, the Alemanni and the Burgundians sacked cities in Gaul and even down to Hispania. Cities in northern Italy were laid to waste. The first massive wave of Germanic invasions was repelled by the valiant efforts of emperors such as Maximinus Thrax, Gallienus, Claudius Gothicus, Aurelian or Probus. But 150 years later, the Western Roman Empire was not so lucky anymore to have such capable emperors. Thus, this time, the Germanic invaders were not driven back. They were able to establish themselves on the territory of the empire. Now, of course, not all of them fought against the Romans. Some were faithful allies. The Franks, for example, heroically fought for Rome, defending the Rhine frontier in early 407 successfully against the Vandals, pushing them back. But then more Germanic nations joined the Vandals, and then the Franks were overcome. The Franks, in fact, were for a long time loyal allies of the empire, and only in the last decades of the Western Roman Empire started expanding. But many other Germanic people actually fought as foederati for the empire. In 451, for instance, a large coalition of Visigoths, Franks and Burgundians defeated together with the Romans under Aetius the Huns and their allies. And I am sure that in some cases there certainly were also peaceful settlements here or there. In some regions, the Romans even willingly joined the barbarians. Many runaway slaves, gladiators or peasants joined the barbarians, forming their own fighting units, the famous Bacchaudai rebels. They often helped the barbarians because they would sometimes prefer to live in the new Germanic kingdoms as compared to the quite often unfair society of the Roman Empire. And initially, when the Goths crossed into Roman territory in the mid-370s, they really were refugees, fleeing from the brutal Huns themselves. Only after the Romans treated them quite badly did they rebel and went on a rampage, famously defeating the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD. So it is not quite as easy to say that the Germanic invaders were all evil. We see that the reality is, as so often, much more nuanced. But we have to acknowledge, based on contemporary accounts, but also based on archaeological evidence of many destroyed cities dating back to the crisis of the 3rd century or dating back to the invasions of the Western Roman Empire from the 5th century, that the Germanic invaders were in general not peacefully settled within the borders of the Western Roman Empire. There was murder, there was killing, bloodshed, and many other atrocities committed, and the narrative of a peaceful settlement tells us much more about our own modern zeitgeist than it does tell us what really happened. It shows us that modern historians have their own biases, their own narratives, and their own wishful thinking. And I'm sure that if some of those historians had lived through some brutal wars or invasions themselves, maybe their books would not paint quite as rosy a picture of the Germanic invasions. And if you are interested in learning more about how the Roman borders in Raetia and Noricum fell, you can watch this video here in the upper right corner. But if you are more interested in how the Germanic tribes overran Gaul and Spain, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago, and bene valete.